What if the oldest evidence we possess wasn't meant to mark the beginning of human memory, but to preserve the ending of something far greater? What if the artifacts we call ancient are actually echoes of a world that came before, whispering through clay and stone about civilizations we were never meant to forget? Beneath the weight of 6,000 years, buried in desert sands and sealed behind museum glass, fragments of the past refuse to stay silent. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, stone temples aligned to stars that vanished from view millennia ago, mathematical formulas that predate their supposed inventors by over 1,000 years. Each piece carries the faint pulse of hands long turned to dust, yet the knowledge they preserved burns as clearly now as the day it was carved. This is not the story of how civilization began. This is the story of how it might have been rebuilt. Before we descend into those shadowed ruins together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to the kind of history that lives in the space between documented fact and ancient mystery. And if you're still here, listening in the quiet hours or drifting towards sleep, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what hour you're keeping. I like to imagine these whispers traveling across time zones, carried softly into the dark corners of the night where questions feel safer than answers. The evidence begins not with certainty, but with strangeness. In the 19th century, archaeologists digging through the ruins of southern Iraq expected to find the humble beginnings of human civilization. Crude tools, primitive scratches, the hesitant first attempts at writing and organization. What they uncovered instead shattered that expectation entirely. Clay tablets emerged from the earth already speaking in complete sentences. Cities revealed themselves as geometric patterns, astronomically aligned, engineered with precision that defied their supposed age. Mathematical systems appeared fully formed, with no evolutionary trail leading backward to simpler versions. And everywhere, in the language itself, in the architecture, in the star charts and flood narratives, there was a sense of inheritance, not invention. The Sumerians, the people who left these records behind, did not claim to be first. They wrote of kingship descending from heaven. They spoke of restoring what had been before. They remembered a great deluge that ended an earlier world. And they built their cities on the ruins of something older still. This pattern, this unsettling sophistication appearing without precedent, does not belong to Sumer alone. Across the globe, separated by oceans and millennia, other cultures left similar traces. Stone structures built with astronomical precision before recorded history. Flood narratives that mirror each other in impossible detail. Advanced knowledge appearing suddenly as though transplanted from somewhere or someone else. What you're about to hear is a journey through those traces, through clay tablets that chart Venus with modern accuracy, through temples carved from bedrock 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture should have allowed such ambition, through Egyptian mysteries that predate the pharaohs, through mathematical wisdom encoded in base 60, still shaping every clock and compass we use today. We will walk the boundary between archaeology and enigma, between documented evidence and tantalizing possibility. We will examine what the ancients themselves claimed about their origins, and we will ask the question that haunts every artifact, every ruin, every tablet that speaks too clearly for its time. Were they the first, or were they the last survivors of something far older? The clay remembers, the stone remembers, and in the silence between the fragments, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the whisper of a forgotten world, waiting to be remembered again. The story begins in Sumer, but it does not end there. It spirals backward through time, through flood and fire, through knowledge preserved and civilizations erased, until we arrive at a question that changes everything. What if history, as we know it, is only the part that survived the burning? But before we speak of gods and flood and forgotten science, we must begin with something simpler. A list. Names and numbers carved into clay. A document so strange, so mathematically absurd, that for decades after its discovery, scholars assumed it must be mythological fiction, religious propaganda, or scribal error compounded over centuries. And yet, the Sumerians treated it as history. They copied it, updated it, cross-referenced it with other records, and preserved it across multiple city-states for over 1,000 years. They called it the Sumerian King List, and it remains one of the most inexplicable documents ever recovered from the ancient world. The most complete version was found in the ruins of Nippur, etched onto a clay prism now catalogued as the Weld-Blundell prism, dated to approximately 2000 BCE, but fragments of the list have been discovered across Mesopotamia, in Ur, Lagash, Larsa, and Babylon. Each version contains slight variations in spelling or sequence, but the core structure remains consistent. This was not a single text. It was a tradition, a record maintained across generations, copied by scribes who believed they were preserving something essential. A chain of kingship stretching back not centuries, but millennia. Not to the founding of Sumer, but to a time before the flood, when kingship itself descended from heaven. The list begins with a statement so matter-of-fact, it almost conceals its strangeness. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. That single line establishes the entire cosmology. Kingship did not evolve. It was not earned through conquest or developed through tribal leadership. It descended, it was given. And the first city to receive it was Eridu, the most ancient of Sumerian settlements, the city sacred to Enki, god of wisdom and the deep waters. And then come the names. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Enmengalana, 28,800 years. Dumuzi, the shepherd, 36,000 years. The numbers continue, stacking impossibly, king after king, reign after reign, each one measured not in human lifetimes, but in epochs. 8 kings in 5 cities before the flood, and their combined reigns total 241,200 years. Not 241 years. 241,000. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these figures immediately. They must be symbolic, genealogical compressions, representations of dynasties rather than individuals, or perhaps records corrupted through oral tradition and later transcription. No human being could live 30,000 years. No monarchy could remain stable for millennia. The numbers are impossible, and therefore they must be myth. And yet, the Sumerians did not treat them as myth. They recorded these reigns with the same administrative precision they used for grain inventories and tax receipts. They listed them alongside later kings whose reigns can be verified through archaeological evidence, whose names appear on monuments, whose battles and building projects left physical traces. The King List does not distinguish between the impossible reigns and the plausible ones. To the scribes, it was all one continuous history. And then comes the line that changes everything. Then the flood swept over. 5 words. No elaboration, no description of the waters or the devastation. just a statement of fact, delivered with the same bureaucratic tone used to record a change in administration. The flood swept over, and when it receded, the kingship descended from heaven once again. But something had changed. The numbers had collapsed. After the flood, the list resumes in the city of Kish. Gaur becomes king and rules for 1,200 years, still impossible by modern standards, but a fraction of what came before. His successor, Gula-Nidaba Anapad, rules for 960 years, then 840, then 720. With each generation, the reigns grow shorter. Within a few dynasties, we reach kings who rule for 30 years, 25 years, numbers that finally begin to resemble human lifetimes. By the time we reach the historical kings of Uruk, Gilgamesh among them, the reigns have normalized entirely. Gilgamesh is credited with 126 years, still legendary, but no longer cosmically absurd, and by the Akkadian period, around 2300 BCE, the King List records reigns that match external evidence almost perfectly. The transition is not gradual, it is abrupt. Before the flood, kings are nearly immortal. After the flood, mortality returns in stages, as though something fundamental about human existence had been altered by the deluge, as though the world before the flood operated under different rules, and the catastrophe that destroyed it also reset the biological and temporal framework of reality itself. So, what are we to make of this? The easy answer, the one repeated in textbooks and academic papers, is that the antediluvian kings represent mythological archetypes, divine figures whose reigns symbolize the era when gods walked the earth. The long lifespans are poetic exaggeration, a way of emphasizing the antiquity and divine sanction of kingship. The flood marks the transition from mythic prehistory to recorded history, from the age of gods to the age of men. Case closed. But that explanation falters when you examine the numbers themselves. Because they are not random, the reigns are not poetic flourishes or wild guesses. They follow patterns. Many of the figures are multiples of 3,600, a number the Sumerians called a sar, represented by a special symbol in their mathematical system. 3,600 was also the number of seconds in an hour, the base unit of their sexagesimal timekeeping system. And curiously, it corresponds closely to the orbital period of a hypothetical outer planet, a detail Zecharia Sitchin would later seize upon in his controversial theories about the Anunnaki and Nibiru. Other reigns are multiples of 60, the foundation of Sumerian mathematics, or combinations of sacred numbers embedded throughout their astronomical and architectural systems. The precision suggests encoding, as though the King List were not merely recording time, but calculating it, embedding information in a numerical framework designed to survive translation and transcription. If the list were pure mythology, why construct it with mathematical rigor? If it were genealogical compression, why use consistent ratios? And if it were scribal error, why does every copy preserve the same impossible figures? There is another possibility, stranger and harder to dismiss. What if the antediluvian kings were not individuals at all, but dynasties, institutions, or epochs? What if each reign represents not the lifespan of a single ruler, but the duration of the entire civilization or cultural phase? In that reading, Alulim's 28,800 years might correspond to the span of time during which Eridu served as a dominant center of power. The 8 antediluvian kings might represent 8 distinct cultural periods, each lasting thousands of years, compressed by later scribes into individual rulers because the original context had been lost. This interpretation finds some support in the archaeological record. Eridu's occupation layers stretch back nearly 7,000 years, far deeper than any other Sumerian city. Excavations reveal settlement after settlement, each one building atop the ruins of the last, temples reconstructed in the same sacred footprint across millennia. The city was continuously inhabited from the Ubaid period, around 5,400 BCE, through the rise of Sumerian civilization. That's not 28,800 years, but it is a span of time far beyond any individual human life, long enough to seem eternal to those living within it. Perhaps the antediluvian kings were not men, but monuments to continuity, symbols of institutional memory preserved through catastrophe. Perhaps what the list records is not the longevity of rulers, but the longevity of rule itself, the unbroken thread of civilization stretching back into the mists before the flood. And perhaps the reason the reigns shortened so dramatically afterward is not because humans became mortal, but because the world became fragmented. The great unified centers of power collapsed. Cities rose and fell more quickly. Memory became uncertain. And the list, trying to preserve a sense of continuity, could only record what remained: shorter reigns, broken dynasties, the scattered remnants of what had been whole. But there is yet another pattern buried in the King List, one that stretches beyond Sumer entirely. The Sumerians were not the only culture to record impossibly long reigns before a great flood. The ancient Egyptians maintained king lists that attributed reigns of thousands of years to the gods and demigods who ruled before the first dynasty. The Manetho fragments, compiled by an Egyptian priest in the 3rd century BCE, describe divine kings who governed for 13,900 years, followed by demigods who ruled for 11,000 more. In Hindu tradition, the Puranas describe cycles of time in which kings of the Satya Yuga, the golden age before corruption entered the world, lived for 100,000 years. The Vedic texts speak of dynasties stretching back through incomprehensible spans, rulers who witnessed the rise and fall of entire cosmic cycles. The biblical genealogies in Genesis record patriarchs who lived for centuries: Methuselah for 969 years, Noah for 950, lifespans that dwarf modern human experience, but pale beside the antediluvian Sumerian kings. Even in China, the earliest legendary emperors are credited with reigns spanning thousands of years. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is said to have ruled for over a century, but earlier figures in Chinese mythology governed for epochs, shaping the land and teaching humanity the arts of civilization before stepping back into legend. The pattern repeats. Across continents, across cultures that had no contact with one another, the same story emerges. Before the great catastrophe, before the flood or the fall, or the end of the Golden Age, time moved differently. Rulers lived longer. Civilizations lasted millennia. And then something broke. The deluge came. The world reset. And in its aftermath, humanity began again, mortal, fragmented, struggling to remember what had been lost. Perhaps these lists are not history in the way we understand it, but perhaps they are not fiction either. Perhaps they are something else entirely, a form of encoded memory, a way of saying that yes, there was a world before this one, and it was older than you can imagine, and it ended, and we are what remains. The Sumerian King List does not ask us to believe that individual men ruled for 30,000 years. It asks us to believe that something lasted that long. Some form of order, some thread of continuity, some knowledge that survived long enough to be passed down, copied, preserved, even when the scribes no longer understood what they were recording. And perhaps that is the true purpose of the list. Not to document individual kings, but to document survival itself. To say we were here, we endured, we remember, and what we remember reaches back further than the flood, further than the cities, further than the first plough turned in Mesopotamian soil. We remember a time when kingship descended from heaven, when gods taught mortals how to build and plant and write, when the world was whole and the reigns of kings were measured not in years, but in ages. And then the flood swept over, and everything changed. But the memory remained, pressed into clay, copied across centuries, carried forward through the long silence of history, not as proof, but as testimony, a strange, stubborn insistence that the world is older than we think, that civilization rose before, that something came before us, and that if we dig deep enough, listen carefully enough, we might still hear the echo of those impossible reigns, those antediluvian kings whispering across the millennia, telling us that we have forgotten something vast. Every culture on earth remembers the flood. Not some cultures, not most, every single one. From the windswept coasts of Scandinavia to the volcanic islands of Polynesia, from the Amazon basin to the Australian outback, humanity carries within its collective memory the story of a great deluge that nearly ended the world. The details shift, the names change, the gods who sent the waters differ from one tradition to the next, but the core remains constant. There was a world before this one. It was destroyed by water. Only a few survived. And from those survivors, civilization began again. The oldest written account comes from Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets that predate the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE, but drawing from even earlier sources, tells the story of Utnapishtim, a man chosen by the god Ea to survive the coming catastrophe. The gods, disturbed by the noise and corruption of humanity, decide to send a flood to wipe the earth clean. But Ea, bound by oath not to warn mankind directly, speaks to the reed, walls of Utnapishtim's house, knowing the man inside will hear. He instructs Utnapishtim to tear down his dwelling and build a boat, a massive vessel coated in pitch, divided into compartments, strong enough to withstand the deluge. The dimensions are given, the construction materials specified, the livestock and craftsmen to be brought aboard, catalogued with bureaucratic precision. When the flood comes, it is apocalyptic. The storm god Adad thunders across the heavens. The Anunnaki lift their torches, setting the land ablaze with lightning. The dikes of heaven break open. For 6 days and 6 nights, the waters rise until even the gods watching from above are terrified by what they have unleashed. They huddle like dogs, cowering against the outer wall of heaven, and the goddess Ishtar cries out in regret, lamenting the destruction of her children. On the 7th day, the waters begin to recede. The boat comes to rest on Mount Nisir. Utnapishtim sends out a dove. It returns. He sends out a swallow. It returns. Finally, he sends out a raven, and it does not come back. The bird has found land. The world has survived. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah are impossible to ignore. The divine warning, the ark, the animals, the dove and the raven, the mountain, even the duration, 7 days in the Gilgamesh version, 40 days in Genesis, suggests a shared origin, a common source from which both traditions drew. But the Sumerian version is older, much older. And it is not alone. In the Hindu Matsya Purana, the god Vishnu appears to a king named Manu in the form of a fish and warns him of a great flood that will destroy all life. He instructs Manu to build a massive boat and gather seeds of all plants, pairs of all animals, and the 7 sages to preserve knowledge. When the flood comes, Vishnu, now grown to an enormous size, tows the boat through the churning waters until they subside, and Manu becomes the progenitor of the new human race. In ancient China, the Great Flood of Gunyu is recorded in texts dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE. The Emperor Gun tries to stop the waters by building dikes, but fails. His son Yu succeeds by dredging channels and guiding the waters into the sea, a task that takes 13 years. The flood is remembered as a defining moment in Chinese history, the catastrophe that necessitated the birth of organized civilization, hydraulic engineering, and centralized authority. The Hopi of North America speak of the end of the Third World, destroyed by water after humanity became corrupt and forgot the teachings of the Creator. A select few, those who still remembered the sacred ways, were saved by climbing inside hollow reeds that floated above the floodwaters. When the waters receded, they emerged into the Fourth World, the one we inhabit now. The Inca and their predecessors told of Viracocha, the creator god, who destroyed the world with a great flood after the people turned wicked. Only 2 survivors remained, a man and a woman sheltered in a floating box. From them, humanity was reborn. In Australian Aboriginal tradition, the Gunwingu people remember a time when the sea rose and drowned the land, forcing their ancestors to flee to higher ground. The story is not mythological in tone. It is historical, matter of fact, a record passed down through oral tradition for so many generations that the event it describes has become inseparable from the identity of the people who survived it. The Greeks had Deucalion and Pyrrha, saved from Zeus's flood by building a chest and floating for 9 days until the waters subsided. The Aztecs remembered 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by a different cataclysm, one of them by water. The Mapuche of South America, the Yoruba of West Africa, the tribes of Borneo, the Norse with their Ragnarok, which begins with the breaking of the great wolf's chains and ends with the world submerged beneath the waves. Over 200 distinct flood myths have been catalogued across every inhabited continent, and the question that haunts every anthropologist, every historian who encounters them, is this: why? Mainstream scholarship offers the conventional answer. Floods are common. Rivers overflow. Coastlines erode. Tsunamis devastate populations. Early agrarian societies, settled along fertile river valleys, would have experienced catastrophic flooding regularly. These localized disasters, traumatic and deadly, became encoded in cultural memory, exaggerated over generations, mythologized, and eventually elevated to cosmic significance. The flood myths, according to this view, are not evidence of a single global event. They are evidence of universal human experience with natural disaster, independent invention, not shared memory. And yet, the details resist that explanation. Why do so many of these stories specify a single man or family chosen to survive? Why do they describe a vessel, often with precise dimensions? Why do they include the motif of birds sent out to test for dry land? Why do they consistently link the flood to divine judgment, to the corruption of a previous age, to the deliberate destruction of a world that had gone wrong? These are not generic disaster stories. They are too specific, too structurally similar, too consistent in their theological and moral framing. It is as though humanity is remembering the same event, filtered through different languages, reshaped by different geographies, but rooted in a single original trauma. And then the geologists arrived. In the mid-20th century, researchers studying ice cores from Greenland and sediment layers across the northern hemisphere discovered something extraordinary. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate underwent a sudden, catastrophic shift. Temperatures plunged, glaciers advanced. The planet, which had been warming steadily since the end of the last ice age, was thrown back into deep freeze almost overnight. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, lasted for approximately 1,200 years before ending just as abruptly. Temperatures spiked, ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, coastlines that had been inhabited for millennia vanished beneath the waves. What caused the Younger Dryas? For decades, the prevailing theory involved disruptions to ocean currents, massive freshwater pulses from melting glaciers that altered the Gulf Stream and triggered a climate feedback loop. But in recent years, a more controversial hypothesis has gained traction, evidence of a cosmic impact. Nanodiamonds, microscopic particles formed under extreme heat and pressure, have been found in sediment layers corresponding to the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Elevated levels of iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in asteroids. Spherules, tiny glassy beads created by the instantaneous melting and cooling of rock. Charcoal layers indicating widespread wildfires. All of it concentrated in a narrow geological band dated to approximately 10,800 BCE. The hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid, possibly fragmenting as it entered the atmosphere, struck the North American ice sheet, triggering immediate and catastrophic consequences: massive wildfires, tsunamis, rapid glacial melting. The injection of debris into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the planet into a prolonged cold snap. When the dust settled and the ice finally melted, the resulting sea level rise would have been devastating to coastal populations. Cities, ports, river valleys, entire civilizations, if they existed, would have been submerged. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Enough to end a world. Enough to force the survivors inland, into the highlands, into the mountains, where they would have looked back at the drowned lands below and remembered, and told their children, and their children's children, until the memory became myth, until the myth became scripture, until the event itself, undeniable in its impact, became inseparable from the divine. Because if the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, if a cosmic catastrophe truly reshaped the planet 12,000 years ago, then the flood myths are not fictions. They are eyewitness accounts, distorted by time, but rooted in truth. They are humanity's oldest historical records, passed down orally for 10,000 years before writing existed to fix them in place. And if that is true, then what else might the myths be telling us? The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Maya, they all insisted that their knowledge, their cities, their laws came from before the flood. That civilization was not invented after the deluge, but remembered. That the survivors carried with them something precious: blueprints, star charts, agricultural techniques, architectural principles, fragments of a lost world encoded in ritual and preserved through myth. What if they were right? What if the flood was not the beginning of civilization, but the end of something older? A reset, not a start. The myths speak of antediluvian kings who reigned for thousands of years. They speak of cities that existed before the waters came. They speak of knowledge so advanced it could only have been given by gods. And then the gods departed. The waters rose. The world drowned. And the survivors, clutching what little they could save, began again. Modern archaeology has tried to dismiss these stories as allegory, but the geological evidence will not cooperate. The Younger Dryas was real. The sea level rise was real. The climate catastrophe was real. And if the disaster was real, why shouldn't the memory be real too? Perhaps the flood myths are not metaphors. Perhaps they are history, the oldest history we have, preserved not in stone or clay, but in the one medium that predates all others, the human voice. Story passed from survivor to child, from elder to initiate, from priest to scribe, until finally, in Sumer, in Babylon, in Israel, someone wrote it down. And we, 10,000 years later, are still reading it, still trying to understand what it means, still asking the question that every flood myth, in every culture, forces us to confront. What world existed before this one? Who lived there? What did they know? And when the waters finally receded, what did they carry with them into the new age? The answer, if it exists, lies buried beneath the waves, beneath the silt, beneath centuries of scholarship that refuse to take the myths seriously. But the stories remain, patient, persistent, waiting for us to remember. In 1963, a shepherd noticed something strange on a hillside in southeastern Turkey. Stones, too many stones, arranged too deliberately to be natural. The sight was noted, briefly surveyed, and dismissed. The stones were assumed to be remnants of a Byzantine cemetery, nothing remarkable, nothing worth excavating. For 30 years, the hill kept its secret. Then, in 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived and began to dig. What he found should not have been possible. Beneath the soil, beneath centuries of sediment and silence, lay massive limestone pillars, carved with intricate reliefs, arranged in precise circular formations. T-shaped monoliths, some weighing over 10 tons, set in patterns that spoke of deliberate design, astronomical knowledge, and organized labor on a scale that defied everything archaeologists thought they knew about the ancient world. The radiocarbon dates came back, 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years old, older than pottery, older than metalworking, older than the wheel, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000. Göbekli Tepe was built in a time when human beings were supposed to be scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, living hand to mouth, possessing no architecture beyond temporary shelters, no art beyond cave, paintings, no social organization complex enough to move stones weighing multiple tons across miles of landscape and arrange them according to celestial alignments. And yet here it stood, a temple complex covering 22 acres, with at least 20 circular stone enclosures identified so far, and ground-penetrating radar suggested dozens more still buried beneath the earth. This was not a village. There is no evidence of habitation, no cooking fires, no trash heaps, no domestic structures. Göbekli Tepe was built for one purpose only, ritual, a place of gathering, ceremony, and communion with something the builders considered sacred. Religion before civilization, temples before towns, organized belief before organized agriculture. This inverts the entire narrative of human development. For over a century, the accepted model was simple and linear. First, humans learned to farm. Agriculture created surplus. Surplus enabled specialization. Specialization led to social hierarchy, organized labor, and eventually monumental architecture. Religion came later, as a tool to justify power structures and bind communities together. Göbekli Tepe shatters that timeline. The people who built these stone circles were hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence of domesticated plants or animals at the site during its construction. They had not yet invented farming, and yet they possessed the knowledge, the coordination, and the motivation to create something that would take decades to complete. Something that served no practical survival function. Something purely symbolic. Unless, of course, they were not inventing. Unless they were remembering. The pillars themselves tell a story, but it is written in a language we can barely read. Each T-shaped monolith stands between 10 and 20 feet tall, carved from single blocks of limestone quarried from the bedrock nearby. The quarry sites have been found, enormous trenches where workers chipped and hammered the stone free using only flint tools. No metal, no bronze, just stone striking stone, hour after hour, until a pillar weighing 15 tons could be levered out of the earth and dragged uphill to the construction site. The precision is unsettling. The pillars are not rough-hewn or primitive. They are smooth, symmetrical, shaped with an understanding of angles and balance that suggests prior experience, inherited technique, knowledge passed down rather than discovered in the moment. The T-shape itself is deliberate, representing something, though what exactly remains unclear. Some researchers suggest they are stylized human figures, abstract representations of gods or ancestors. The horizontal stone at the top forms shoulders, the vertical shaft a body. On some pillars, arms and hands are carved along the sides, bent at the elbows, fingers delicately rendered, reaching towards something unseen. But it is what covers the rest of the pillars that deepens the mystery. Animals, dozens of them, carved in low relief with startling detail. Foxes, boars, lions, bulls, vultures, scorpions, snakes, spiders, each one rendered with anatomical accuracy, muscles defined, postures naturalistic, as though the carvers had studied their subjects intimately. These were not symbolic sketches. They were portraits, and they were arranged in specific patterns, groupings that may correspond to constellations, seasonal cycles, or mythological narratives now lost to time. One pillar shows a vulture clutching a human head. Another depicts a scorpion poised above a circular shape that some interpret as the sun. A third shows what appears to be a comet or meteor streaking across a field of geometric symbols. These are not random decorations. They are telling a story, encoding information, preserving something the builders desperately needed future generations to remember. In 2017, researchers analyzing the arrangement of the animal carvings proposed something extraordinary. The symbols on Pillar 43, known as the vulture stone, may represent a date, a celestial event recorded in stone. Using astronomical software to reconstruct the night sky as it appeared 11,000 years ago, they found that the carvings align with the positions of specific constellations during the summer solstice of approximately 10,950 BCE. If true, this would make Göbekli Tepe not just a temple, but an observatory, a place where the sky was watched, measured, and memorialized in stone. And there is something else carved into that same pillar, a symbol that looks disturbingly like an impact event, radiating lines suggesting explosion or catastrophe, positioned above the animal figures as though marking a moment of cosmic significance. Some researchers have connected this to evidence of a comet strike around 10,800 BCE, an event that may have triggered rapid climate change, the Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe witnessed such an event, or inherited the memory of it, then what we are looking at is not primitive superstition, but disaster documentation. A warning pressed into stone, a way of saying this happened, remember, do not forget. But mainstream archaeology resists this interpretation. The carvings are symbolic, they argue, mythological, not literal records of celestial events. The precision is coincidental. The alignments are approximate, and yet the stones remain, arranged with care, carved with intention, placed according to patterns that mirror the heavens with uncomfortable accuracy. The site is aligned to the cardinal directions. The pillars face specific points on the horizon where significant celestial events occur: solstices, equinoxes, the rising of particular stars. This is not accident, it is design, knowledge applied. And then, around 8000 BCE, something inexplicable happened. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, buried. The stone circles were carefully filled with rubble and soil, layer by layer, as though the site were being preserved rather than discarded. Thousands of tons of material were hauled in and packed around the pillars, hiding them completely, transforming the temple complex into an artificial hill. This was not erosion. It was not natural sedimentation. It was intentional entombment. Why would a people invest generations of labor into building a monumental structure only to hide it? Some suggest climate change made the region uninhabitable and the site was sealed as an act of reverence. Others propose it was a response to catastrophe, a ritual closure, a way of protecting sacred knowledge during a time of collapse. And some whisper a darker possibility, that Göbekli Tepe was buried to conceal it, to ensure that what it represented, what it remembered, would not be found until the right moment, or perhaps not at all. Because here is what haunts every archaeologist who studies the site. Göbekli Tepe is not a beginning. It is too sophisticated, too refined, too complete. There is no learning curve, no evidence of evolution from simpler structures. It appears fully formed, as though the knowledge required to build it already existed. And if it existed in 9600 BCE, where did it come from? Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometer surveys reveal that less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. Beneath the surface, dozens of additional structures wait, buried under millennia of soil. What they contain, what they depict, what knowledge they preserve, remains unknown. But if what has been uncovered so far is any indication, the deeper we dig, the older the knowledge becomes, and the more it looks like inheritance. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not the work of primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling towards civilization. Perhaps it was the work of survivors, people who carried within them the memory of something greater, something that had been lost, and who poured that memory into stone before it could vanish entirely. The temple as archive, the pillars as hard drives, a desperate attempt to preserve what the flood or the fire or the ice had nearly erased. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, Göbekli Tepe is the remnant of a network, one node in a web of sacred sites that once stretched across the ancient world, connected by knowledge, by ritual, by shared understanding of the cosmos. If that is true, then what lies beneath the soil of Turkey may only be the beginning. Other sites, older still, may wait in unexcavated places, carrying fragments of the same forgotten story. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no written records, no king lists, no flood narratives inscribed in clay. But they left something perhaps more enduring, stone. Silent, patient, impossibly heavy stone, arranged in patterns that refuse to fade, carved with images that refuse to be forgotten. A message sent forward, through time, waiting for the moment when we would be ready to ask the right questions. And the question Göbekli Tepe forces us to ask is this: what if history didn't begin when we thought it did? What if civilization is older, stranger, and more interrupted than the textbooks allow? What if the people we call primitive were not primitive at all, but echoes, inheritors of knowledge from a world that came before, a world that built in stone and watched the stars and understood things we are only now beginning to remember? The pillars stand in the Turkish sun, patient as always, holding their secrets beneath layers of earth and time. And beneath them, still buried, still waiting, lie the answers we are not yet ready to uncover. But there is knowledge that requires more than one lifetime to gather. Knowledge that demands not years but centuries, not generations but entire epochs of continuous observation. Knowledge that should not exist in the hands of people who supposedly had just learned to plant seeds. The ancient world knew things it should not have known. In temples across Egypt, Babylon, India, and Mesoamerica, carved into stone and pressed into clay, we find astronomical calculations of staggering precision, not crude approximations, not mythological guesswork, but exact measurements, complex formulas, and observations that required sophisticated mathematics and centuries of accumulated data. The kind of knowledge that takes civilizations multiple generations to develop, refined through meticulous record-keeping, preserved through unbroken chains of scholarly tradition. And yet this knowledge appears not at the end of these civilizations, but at their beginning, already complete, already precise, as though it had been inherited rather than discovered. Consider the precession of the equinoxes. This is not something you can observe in a single lifetime or even a dozen. It is the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a cosmic grinding that causes the position of the stars to shift against the backdrop of the seasons. The entire cycle takes 25,920 years to complete. 1 degree of shift requires 72 years of observation. To map the full pattern, to recognize it as a cycle rather than random drift, requires multi-generational data collection, sophisticated trigonometry, and instruments capable of measuring celestial positions with remarkable accuracy. The ancient Greeks are credited with discovering precession around 127 BCE, when Hipparchus noticed the stars had shifted since earlier Babylonian records. This was already impressive, a triumph of Hellenistic astronomy, proof that ancient science could achieve genuine discovery through patience and mathematics. But Hipparchus was not the first. The Babylonians knew about precession centuries before him. Their astronomical diaries, stretching back into the deep archives of Mesopotamian temple libraries, tracked stellar positions with precision that allowed Hipparchus to make his comparison. They had been watching, recording, calculating long before the Greeks arrived, and before the Babylonians, the Sumerians. Tablets from Uruk and Nippur reference the changing positions of stars across vast stretches of time. They speak of ages, of eras defined by which constellation rose at the spring equinox. The age of Taurus, the age of Aries. They understood that the heavens moved through cycles longer than kingdoms, longer than empires. How? To observe precession accurately requires not just one civilization's worth of data, but an unbroken chain of observation spanning thousands of years. It requires institutions that survive wars, collapses, migrations. It requires a culture so committed to preserving knowledge that it continues recording celestial positions generation after generation, even when the immediate purpose is unclear. Or it requires something else: access to records that were already ancient when the Sumerians found them. Knowledge passed down from an earlier age, when someone else had been watching the stars. The evidence continues beyond Mesopotamia. On the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, carved into sandstone with exquisite detail, is one of the most controversial artifacts in archaeology. The Dendera Zodiac, a circular star map showing the constellations as they appeared in the night sky, complete with planetary positions, decans, and symbols representing astronomical events. When French archaeologists removed it in 1821 and brought it to the Louvre, the debates began immediately. How old was it? The temple itself dated to the Ptolemaic period, around 50 BCE, but the zodiac's design, the precision of its astronomical alignments, and the archaic nature of some of its symbols suggested something older, much older. Some researchers, analyzing the positions of the constellations depicted, claimed the zodiac represented the sky as it would have appeared around 10,500 BCE, during the age of Leo, when the Sphinx allegedly gazed directly at its celestial counterpart at the spring equinox. Mainstream Egyptologists dismissed this, arguing the zodiac was Ptolemaic, created during a period of Greek influence when Egyptian priests were copying older astronomical traditions, but not actually observing ancient skies. And yet, the precision remained unexplained. The zodiac shows not just the 12 familiar constellations, but the exact positions of planets, the path of the ecliptic, the orientation of the Milky Way, details that require sophisticated observation and mathematical modeling. If it was simply decorative, why was it so accurate? If it was merely copied from older texts, where did those texts come from? The same question haunts other artifacts scattered across the ancient world. In 1929, in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, scholars examining Ottoman archives discovered a map drawn by Turkish Admiral Piri Reis in 1513. The Tai map showed the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and South America with remarkable accuracy. But it also showed something impossible: the northern coast of Antarctica, without ice, the mountains, the bays, the river valleys, all depicted as though the continent were not buried beneath miles of glacial ice, but visible, accessible, mapped. The problem is that Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years. Modern science did not confirm the shape of the landmass beneath the ice until the 1950s, using seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar. How could a 16th century map show this? Piri Reis himself provided the answer in notes written on the map. He had not explored Antarctica. He had copied his map from older sources, charts obtained from the Library of Alexandria, navigational documents that dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, and even earlier, to sources he could not name but described as ancient beyond reckoning. If those source maps were accurate, they had to have been created at a time when Antarctica's coast was visible, not 500 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, but during a period of geological history that predates recorded civilization by thousands of years. Other ancient maps show similar anomalies. The Oronteus Phineus map of 1531, also depicting Antarctica ice-free. The Zeno map of 1380, showing islands in the North Atlantic that have since been submerged. The Boitcher map of 1737, accurately representing Antarctica as two landmasses separated by water, a fact not confirmed until the 20th century. These were not the products of Renaissance exploration. They were copies of copies, each generation of cartographers tracing older sources, trying to preserve knowledge encoded in documents whose origins had been forgotten. The question echoes again. Who made the original maps? Who sailed those coasts when they were still ice-free? And why does no other record of them survive? The astronomical sophistication was not limited to maps and zodiacs. It was embedded in stone. Across the ancient world, megalithic structures align with celestial events with precision that seems impossible for cultures supposedly lacking advanced tools or mathematical systems. Stonehenge, on the Salisbury Plain in England, aligns with the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. But it also tracks lunar cycles, predicting eclipses using the arrangement of its stones as a kind of analog computer. The placement of the heel stone, the station stones, and the Aubrey holes creates a system for calculating the 18.6-year lunar orbital cycle, a period that governs the recurrence of eclipse patterns. To design such a structure requires not just one lifetime of lunar observation, but generations of accumulated data. Someone had to watch the moon rise and set for decades, mark its positions, recognize the patterns, and then encode that knowledge into stone with such precision that it remained functional thousands of years later. At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid, the entrance is aligned so perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise that once a year, for exactly 17 minutes, sunlight floods the interior chamber, illuminating carvings that have waited in darkness for the rest of the year. The engineering required to achieve this, accounting for the angle of the sun, the tilt of the earth, the latitude of the site, suggests an understanding of solar geometry far beyond what we attribute to Neolithic farmers. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan city of Chichen Itza holds the Temple of Kukulkan, a step pyramid designed so that during the spring and autumn equinoxes, the play of light and shadow creates the image of a serpent descending the northern staircase. The effect lasts only a few hours, visible only twice a year, a deliberate demonstration of astronomical knowledge carved into stone. The Mayans tracked Venus with obsessive precision, recording its cycles in codices that survive to this day. They knew the synodic period of Venus, 584 days, with accuracy that rivals modern measurements. They calculated the solar year to 365,2420 days, closer to the true value than the Julian calendar used in Europe until the 16th century. And they understood the long count, a calendar system that tracked time across millennia, cycling through periods of 5,125 years. A framework that suggested they were thinking in epochs, not lifetimes. Where did this knowledge come from? How does a culture, isolated in the jungles of Central America, develop astronomy sophisticated enough to predict planetary conjunctions centuries in advance? The Babylonians, successors to the Sumerians, kept astronomical diaries that stretched back over 800 years of continuous observation. These were not mythological texts. They were data tables, night-by-night records of planetary positions, lunar phases, and eclipses. Modern astronomers have analyzed these tablets and found them accurate to within fractions of a degree. The Babylonians could predict solar and lunar eclipses using something called the Saros cycle, a period of 18 years and 11 days after which the positions of the sun, moon, and earth repeat closely enough to forecast when the next eclipse would occur. To discover the Saros cycle, you need centuries of eclipse observations. You need to recognize that an eclipse that happens today will repeat in a predictable pattern 18 years later. You need mathematics capable of tracking the motion of 3 celestial bodies through space. And you need a civilization stable enough to preserve records across generations without losing the thread. Or you need someone to teach you, someone who already knew. The Egyptians mapped the flooding of the Nile by tracking the heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when the star first becomes visible just before dawn after a period of invisibility. This event coincided almost exactly with the annual flood, the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture. But to use Sirius as a calendar marker requires understanding the difference between the sidereal year, based on the stars, and the solar year, based on the sun. These two cycles do not align perfectly, and over centuries, they drift apart due to precession. The Egyptians knew this. They accounted for it. Temple inscriptions reference the slow drift of Sirius against the calendar, adjustments made to keep the system accurate across millennia. This is not simple observation. This is advanced astronomy applied to practical timekeeping, refined over so many generations that the origins of the system had already become mythological by the time the pyramids were built. And still the question persists. How does a Bronze Age civilization possess knowledge that requires multi-generational observation, sophisticated mathematics, and institutional continuity across centuries? Some researchers propose a controversial answer. The knowledge was not developed. It was inherited, passed down from an earlier, now lost civilization that had already completed the long work of observing, calculating, and encoding the movements of the heavens. A civilization that understood precession, mapped continents, tracked planets, and built structures aligned to celestial events with precision, we struggle to replicate even today. When that civilization fell, whether through flood, climate catastrophe, or some other calamity, fragments of their knowledge survived, carried by refugees, preserved in texts, encoded in monuments that outlasted the cultures that built them. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Maya, all of them inheritors of a tradition older than their own origins. Custodians of a science they no longer fully understood, but faithfully preserved, copying star charts, repeating astronomical formulas, building temples aligned to celestial events, because that was what the ancestors had done, even if the reasons had been forgotten. Perhaps that is why the knowledge appears so suddenly, already complete. Not because ancient peoples were visited by gods or extraterrestrials, but because they were remembering, reconstructing what the flood, the ice, the ages of chaos had nearly erased. Perhaps the astronomical precision was not a miracle. It was a rescue operation, a frantic effort to save what remained of an older world's understanding before it disappeared entirely. And perhaps we, looking back through the static of millennia, are seeing not the birth of science, but its resurrection. Long before the pharaohs carved their names into history, something else was already ancient in Egypt, something already weathered, already forgotten, already waiting beneath the sand like a question no one had thought to ask. The great Sphinx of Giza sits at the edge of the plateau, gazing eastward toward the rising sun, its leonine body stretched across the bedrock, its human face eroded into ambiguity. Egyptologists have long dated it to the reign of Khafre, around 2500 BCE, carved as a monument to the 4th dynasty king whose pyramid rises behind it. The evidence seemed straightforward. The face, they argued, resembles Khafre. The causeway from his pyramid temple leads directly to the Sphinx enclosure. The style fits the Old Kingdom. Case closed. But then geologists looked at the stone. and what they saw didn't match the timeline at all. In the early 1990s, Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, examined the Sphinx enclosure not as an archaeologist searching for cultural context, but as a scientist reading the language written in rock. What he found was water erosion, deep vertical weathering patterns carved into the limestone walls of the trench surrounding the Sphinx. Wave-like undulations, rounded profiles, the unmistakable signature of prolonged rainfall, not wind, not sand abrasion, rainfall. The problem is simple and profound. Egypt has been arid for thousands of years. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced sufficient rainfall to produce that kind of erosion was at the end of the African humid period, somewhere between 5000 and 9000 BCE, possibly earlier. Thousands of years before the first pharaoh, thousands of years before hieroglyphs, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, before the civilization we call ancient Egypt even existed. Schoch's analysis suggested the Sphinx enclosure could be 7,000 to 9,000 years old, perhaps more. Carved during a time when the Sahara was green, when rivers flowed where deserts now stretch, when the climate of North Africa resembled something closer to savanna than sand. Mainstream Egyptology rejected the claim almost universally. The dating, they insisted, was solid. The Sphinx was 4th dynasty, carved under Khafra, no earlier. To suggest otherwise was to dismantle the entire chronology of Egyptian civilization. And yet, the erosion remains, vertical, deep, consistent with water, not wind. And no one has provided a satisfactory alternative explanation. The rock does not lie. It simply weathers, and weathering takes time. If Schoch is correct, then the Sphinx is not a relic of the Old Kingdom. It is a survivor of something older, a monument built by a people we have no name for, a civilization that watched the rains fall and carved stone gods to face the dawn, long before the age of the pharaohs began. And they were not the only ones who thought so. The ancient Egyptians themselves may have believed the Sphinx was older than their own history. In 1857, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette discovered a granite stela in the ruins of a small temple near the Great Pyramid. Known today as the Inventory Stela, it dates to around 670 BCE, carved during the 26th dynasty under Khufu's much later successors. But the inscription it bears tells a different story. It claims that Khufu, the pharaoh credited with building the Great Pyramid, did not build the Sphinx. According to the stela, Khufu found the Sphinx already ancient, buried in sand up to its shoulders. He ordered it excavated and restored. The text goes further. It states that the Sphinx was built long before Khufu's reign, during the Age of the Gods, a time the Egyptians called Zep Tepi, the first time. Egyptologists have largely dismissed the Inventory Stela as a later fabrication, a piece of nationalist propaganda meant to glorify Egypt's deep antiquity during a period of foreign domination. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps the stela is myth dressed as history, or perhaps it is history dressed as myth. A fragment of older knowledge, preserved in stone because the scribes who carved it believed it to be true. Because the ancient Egyptians spoke often of the first time, and they did not speak of it as legend. They spoke of it as memory. Zep Tepi, the era when the gods walked the earth, when Osiris ruled as king, when Thoth inscribed the laws of the cosmos, when the foundations of Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, were laid down. The Egyptians did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have inherited it, passed down from the Neteru, the divine beings who reigned before history began. Every temple, every ritual, every sacred text was said to be a copy of something older, a reenactment of what had been done in the first time. To build a temple was not to create, it was to remember. To inscribe a text was to preserve. To perform a ritual was to align the present with the eternal past. The pyramids themselves, according to the pyramid texts, were not tombs. They were machines of resurrection, designed to guide the soul of the king back to the stars, back to Orion and Sirius, back to the divine source from which the gods had descended. And the alignment of those pyramids suggests something extraordinary. In 1994, Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert published research showing that the three pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafra and Menkaura are positioned to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt with remarkable precision. The alignment is not approximate, it is exact, down to the offset of the smallest pyramid, which reflects the slight misalignment of the faintest star. But here is where it becomes strange. The correlation is most precise not in 2500 BCE, when the pyramids were supposedly built, but around 10,500 BCE, during the astronomical epoch when Orion's belt reached its lowest point in its precessional cycle, a 26,000-year wobble in Earth's axis that shifts the positions of the stars over millennia. At that same date, 10,500 BCE, the Sphinx, if Schoch's erosion analysis is correct, would have been facing directly toward the constellation Leo at the spring equinox, the lion gazing at the lion, Earth, mirroring heaven. Coincidence, perhaps? Or perhaps a deliberate encoding, a celestial timestamp left by architects who understood precession and wanted to mark the true date of their work, knowing that future generations might read the stars and understand. But precision is not limited to alignment. It is carved into every block, every angle, every joint of the structures themselves. The Great Pyramid is a marvel of engineering that defies the technological constraints of its supposed era. Its base is level to within 2 centimeters across 230 meters. Its sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with an error margin of less than 1/15 of a degree. The blocks, some weighing 70 tons, are fitted so tightly that a razor blade cannot slip between them. No mortar, just stone on stone, pressure and gravity holding them in place for over 4,000 years. We are told this was accomplished with copper tools, wooden sledges, and ramps. Copper, a soft metal that deforms under pressure. Wood, which rots and splinters. Ramps, which would have required more material than the pyramid itself to construct. And yet, the pyramid stands. Perfect, silent, and utterly inexplicable. Some researchers have suggested the Egyptians possessed advanced metallurgy, tools we have not yet found, methods lost to time. Others point to the possibility of acoustic levitation, sonic drilling, technologies hinted at in obscure texts but never fully explained. Still others argue the pyramids are not tombs at all, but power plants, resonance chambers, geopolymer castings, structures designed for purposes we no longer remember. What is certain is this: the precision is undeniable, the scale is staggering, and the timeline, when examined closely, does not hold. Deep beneath the sands of Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest sacred sites, lies a structure that seems even more out of place. The Osirion, discovered in 1902 by archaeologists Flinders Petrie and Margaret Murray, it sits behind the temple of Seti I, buried under meters of silt and sand. At first, it was assumed to be part of Seti's construction, a cenotaph built during the 19th dynasty around 1300 BCE. But when the excavation revealed the full structure, that assumption began to crumble. The Osirion is built from massive blocks of red granite and limestone, some weighing over 100 tons. The architecture is cyclopean, megalithic, utterly unlike the refined, decorated temples of the New Kingdom. There are no inscriptions, no cartouches, no hieroglyphs identifying its builder. Just stone. Massive, plain, functional. The style resembles nothing from dynastic Egypt. It resembles the Valley Temple at Giza. It resembles the core masonry of the Sphinx Temple. It resembles structures that predate the decorative flourishes of later pharaohs, buildings from an earlier time when architecture was about permanence, not propaganda. The Osirian was flooded when it was found, sitting below the water table, its central hall filled with dark, still water. Some researchers have noted that the structure appears designed to interact with water, with channels, basins, and islands arranged in a way that suggests ritual, purification, or something else entirely. The Egyptians believed Abydos was the burial place of Osiris, the god who died and was resurrected, who ruled the underworld and judged the dead. To be buried at Abydos was to be close to the source, to the place where death could be undone. But Osiris, like so many Egyptian gods, was not a creation of dynastic religion. He was older. His cult stretched back into the shadows of pre-dynastic Egypt, back to a time when gods and kings were indistinguishable, back to the first time. The Osirian, some argue, is not a cenotaph built by Seti. It is a remnant of that older age, buried by time, rediscovered by a pharaoh who recognized its sanctity and built his temple above it to honor what had already been sacred for thousands of years. If true, then the Osirian is not 3,300 years old. It is far, far older. Modern dating methods have only deepened the controversy. Radiocarbon dating, when applied to organic materials found in pyramid mortar, has occasionally returned dates hundreds of years older than the reigns of the pharaohs to whom the pyramids are attributed. Thermoluminescence testing of the Sphinx enclosure has suggested construction dates far earlier than 2500 BCE. Geological surveys of water damage, wind erosion, and seismic activity all point toward greater antiquity. And yet, Egyptology as an institution resists. The timeline is sacred. The chronology is fixed. To move the Sphinx back 5,000 years is to admit that everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization is incomplete. It is to open the door to the possibility that Egypt was not the beginning. It was the continuation. That the temples, the pyramids, the knowledge encoded in stone and star were not invented by the pharaohs, but inherited from whoever came before. From the survivors of the deluge, from the builders of the first time, from a people whose names we do not know, but whose works remain, patient and imperishable, waiting for us to ask the right questions. The Egyptians themselves left clues. In the Edfu building texts inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus, there is a story. It speaks of the island of the egg, a primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. On that island, the gods built the first temple, a structure of pure knowledge, containing the books of Thoth, the architect of the cosmos. This temple, the texts say, was destroyed in a great flood. But before it was lost, the knowledge was copied, preserved, and passed to the survivors, who carried it to new lands and built new temples in imitation of the first. Each temple in Egypt, the texts claim, was built according to the plan of that original, following dimensions, alignments, and proportions laid down in the age of the gods. Not invention, imitation, not progress, preservation. And perhaps that is what we see when we stand before the Sphinx, weathered and enigmatic, when we walk through the Osirian's flooded halls, when we trace the alignments of the pyramids back through procession to a date long before history. Perhaps we are not looking at the birth of civilization. We are looking at its memory, at what was saved, at what the flood did not take. And perhaps the ancient Egyptians, who called their land Kemet, the Black Land, the fertile soil left by the Nile's annual inundation, understood something we have forgotten, that every rise follows a fall, that every beginning is built on ruins, and that the greatest monuments are not declarations of power, but acts of remembrance, stone prayers against forgetting, messages sent forward through time from an age we can no longer name but can still, if we listen carefully, almost remember. Long before archaeologists brushed dust from the first Sumerian tablet, long before museum shelves groaned under the weight of clay and stone, there were rumours of books that no one alive had seen. Not ordinary books, but antediluvian records, texts said to have been written before the flood, hidden away while the waters rose, and preserved somewhere beyond the reach of time. Ancient cultures spoke of these books the way we speak of lost hard drives full of vanished data, except what they feared losing was not just information, but memory itself. The memory of a world that ended. In the Hebrew and early Christian traditions, these whispers take shape around a single enigmatic work, the Book of Enoch. It does not appear in the standard Bible, at least not in most modern versions. For centuries, it survived on the fringes, preserved in Ethiopian monasteries, quoted in passing by early church fathers, almost as if history itself were trying to forget it, and failing. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, is not just a righteous man in this text. He becomes a scribe of heaven, taken up into the realms above, given visions of what existed before the deluge and what will exist after. He walks among beings the text calls watchers, angels who descended to earth in the days before the flood and crossed a line they were never meant to cross. According to Enoch, the watchers did not merely observe humanity. They taught. They instructed. They handed down knowledge that was, in the language of the book, forbidden. They taught the cutting of roots and the mixing of herbs, crafts of medicine, and, perhaps, poison. They revealed the secrets of metalwork, how to extract ore from rock, how to forge blades and weapons, how to polish mirrors that could catch the sun. They imparted the turning of the heavens, the names of stars, the courses of the luminaries, astrology, divination, enchantments. One is said to have taught the smitings of the womb, techniques that sound disturbingly like early control over fertility and birth. Another taught the making of jewelry, the use of cosmetics, the art of altering appearance, technologies of beauty and deception. In the worldview of Enoch, these are not innocent discoveries. They are accelerants. Humanity, not yet ready to bear such tools, uses them for violence, domination, and corruption. The earth itself cries out under the weight of bloodshed. The flood becomes not just a punishment, but a forced reset, a cosmic quarantine. The knowledge the Watchers brought must be buried, drowned, or locked beyond human reach. And yet the text insists on a paradox. Before judgment falls, Enoch is instructed to write, to inscribe what he has seen and heard on tablets, and to leave those writings for a remote generation that is to come. Wisdom given before the flood, sealed during it, and destined to resurface after. A library that passes through catastrophe like an ark made not of wood, but of words. This same pattern appears in another tradition, separated from Enoch's world by language, geography, and culture, and yet mysteriously parallel, the writings of Berossus, a Babylonian priest of the 3rd century BCE. Berossus had access to temple archives in Babylon, records no modern eye will ever see. Drawing from those, he wrote a history of the world for his Greek-speaking patrons. Only fragments survive, quoted by later authors, like dim reflections of a vanished text. But what they describe is strangely familiar. Berossus speaks of a time before the flood when kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, echoing the Sumerian King List, and of a being named Oannes, part fish, part man, who rose from the sea to instruct humanity. Oannes and his companions, sometimes called Apkallu, taught writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, even how to build cities. They did not appear gradually. They emerged fully formed, bearing a complete system of civilization, and then, when their work was done, they returned to the deep. In Berossus's account, the antediluvian sages don't just teach and vanish, they also preserve. Before the Great Flood arrives, a king named Xisuthros, often equated with the Mesopotamian flood hero Ziusudra or the biblical Noah, is warned to bury the most important writings in the city of Sippar, the city of the sun. After the waters recede, he is instructed to return, unearth the writings, and use them to restore the world. The echo with Enoch is unmistakable. Secret teachings, a coming deluge, warnings to inscribe and conceal. A promise that one day, when the waters are gone and humanity is ready, the knowledge will be recovered, not reinvented. And again, that same motif. The teachers themselves, not entirely human, standing in the shadows between God and man. In Mesopotamia, they are the Apkallu. In Enoch, they are the Watchers. Different names, similar functions, bearers of knowledge that upends the normal order. The Watchers, as described in Enoch, do not resemble the gentle guardian angels of later paintings. They are massive, luminous, terrifying. They descend to Mount Hermon in the north, swear oaths among themselves, and take human wives. Their children are giants, the Nephilim, whose violence fills the world. But beneath the mythic language, something else pulses. An unease about knowledge that arrives too quickly, too completely, from somewhere beyond. Human beings, the text suggests, are not supposed to know everything at once. To the compilers of Enoch, metallurgy, cosmetics, advanced astronomy, and esoteric medicine are not marks of a maturing civilization. They are clues that something has gone wrong. The timeline is out of order. We have skipped stages. Someone has fast-forwarded the tape. If the Book of Enoch preserved the Hebrew memory of antediluvian instruction, Egypt held on to its own version, encoded not in the stories of angels, but in the figure of a god, Thoth. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, is credited with inventing writing, mathematics, astronomy, and the sacred arts. He measures the heavens, calculates the years, keeps the records by which the gods themselves remember. He is called Lord of Time, Master of Books, he who reckons the stars. In temple inscriptions, his role is not creative in the modern sense. He does not experiment. He records what already is. He registers the geometry of the cosmos and anchors it in symbols. Later, Greek writers visiting Egypt heard of a legendary body of writings attributed to Thoth, the Books of Thoth. Some said there were 20,000 of them. Others doubled the number. They were said to contain everything: laws, rituals, magical formulas, star charts, manuals of the soul's journey through the afterlife. At least one story insists that these books were hidden, sealed away, because they held knowledge too dangerous for the uninitiated. In one tale from the Ptolemaic period, a young man discovers a secret book of Thoth. Its pages reveal how to understand the speech of animals, how to see the gods. But when he reads it, calamity follows. Tragedy, madness, and disaster. Eventually, the book must be returned to its watery hiding place, locked again in the depths, as though the world itself rejects premature revelation. The Egyptians also spoke of the House of Life, a kind of temple library where sacred texts were kept, copied, and protected. Some inscriptions suggest that these collections were believed to contain rituals and formulas inherited from a remote, almost mythic past, from the time of Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods walked the earth and founded the original temples. Were these simply origin myths designed to lend authority to priestly traditions? Or were they echoes of something else? A deep intuition that the wisdom they held did not begin with them? Because across cultures, from Enoch's Israel to Berossus's Babylon, to the temples of Egypt, a peculiar conviction repeats. The oldest knowledge is not ours. It is pre-human, or at least prehistoric. It comes from an earlier order, an earlier cycle, an earlier world, and this idea did not die with the ancient scribes. It flowed underground, resurfacing in the secretive traditions often called mystery schools. In Greece, initiates into the Eleusinian mysteries swore oaths of silence about rites said to be older than the Olympian gods. Pythagoras, that strange hybrid of mathematician and mystic, claimed to have studied in Egyptian temples, learning secrets transmitted from Thoth himself. In later centuries, the Hermetic tradition, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a fusion of the Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth, spoke of a primordial wisdom, a prisca theologia, a first theology given at the dawn of time and handed down through a chain of adepts. Medieval alchemists, Renaissance magi, and modern esoteric societies all, in their own ways, claim to be custodians of fragments from that original teaching. A formula here, a symbol there, a set of geometric ratios, a star alignment, a ritual pattern, none of it complete, all of it suggestive. They did not usually describe their work as invention. They called it restoration, recovery, remembrance. They believed they were piecing together a shattered mirror, trying to reconstruct a reflection of something that once existed in full. This is the same posture we saw in the Sumerians with their MI, the divine codes of civilization. It is the same stance taken by Babylonian scholars who copied star lists older than their own kings. It is the same mindset that led Egyptian priests to attribute their temple wisdom to gods who ruled before recorded time. To us, in the modern world, knowledge is often imagined as a staircase climbing upward, each step a new discovery, each generation higher than the last. But to many ancient cultures, knowledge was a slope downward from a lost summit. The past was not primitive. It was golden. It was whole. So they spoke of antediluvian books, Enoch's tablets of heaven, Berossus's buried archives at Sippar, the books of Thoth sealed in hidden chambers, the secret libraries of mystery schools that claimed lineage back to the days before the waters rose. We do not have these books. If they ever existed in the literal way the stories describe, they are gone, dissolved into mud, burned, looted, or simply ground beneath the feet of empires. What we do have are their reflections, later compilations, half-remembered myths, technical data that appears suddenly where it should not, languages that arrive fully formed, rituals that seem already old when they are first recorded. And around all of it, the same quiet insistence. We are not inventing, we are remembering. Perhaps this is only a metaphor, a way for civilizations to sanctify their own achievements by claiming divine origin. Or perhaps it hints at something stranger, that there really was a time before our time, a world whose knowledge did not perish completely in the flood of legend, but survived in caches and codes, in stone and clay, in ratios and rhythms, waiting for someone to find them again. What if the lost libraries of the antediluvian world were never in one place? What if they are scattered across the very records we study today? Fragments embedded in Sumerian star lists, Egyptian temple liturgies, Babylonian omen texts, apocryphal books like Enoch, pieces of a puzzle we no longer remember how to assemble. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those forgotten shelves, tablets stacked in silent chambers, scrolls sealed in stone boxes, inscriptions cut into pillars now lying beneath silt and sea. Imagine the people who hid them, watching the waters climb, knowing that they could not save themselves, but perhaps they could save the memory of what they had learned. To them, knowledge was not a luxury, it was an ark. And if they were right, if we are indeed children not of invention but of remembrance, then every time we rediscover an ancient formula, decode a lost language, or uncover a star chart 15 centuries ahead of its supposed time, we are not moving forward. We are reaching back, fingers brushing faintly against the shelves of a library that belonged to a world before ours. For all the stories, for all the whispers of antediluvian worlds and gifted knowledge, we eventually hit a hard wall. Clay, stone, carbon, and bone. This is where history must stand and be measured. Archaeology, for all its romance, is a discipline of fragments, shards of pottery, scattered foundations, charcoal flecks in ancient hearths. From these, we attempt to build timelines, to say with confidence, this is older, this is younger, this came before that. But even here, in the realm of stratigraphy and radiocarbon, the ground is not as solid as we like to imagine, because every date, every age, every confident line on a timeline begins as an inference. When archaeologists unearth a site, they rely on a hierarchy of methods. The most basic is stratigraphy, the law of superposition. Deeper layers are older, upper layers are younger, assuming the earth has not been disturbed. In theory, this provides a simple ladder of time. In practice, it is a ladder that has been shaken repeatedly by earthquakes, floods, burials, and human hands. Cities are built, destroyed, rebuilt on top of their own ruins. Temples sink, walls collapse, pits are dug. Layers fold into one another like pages in a book left in the rain. The farther back we go, the more those pages blur. To refine the picture, scientists turn to radiocarbon dating. Organic material, charcoal, seeds, bone, textile fibers, contains carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that decays at a predictable rate. Measure the remaining carbon-14, calculate the time since death. A powerful tool, but one with margins and assumptions. Calibration curves must be applied because atmospheric carbon has not been constant. Solar activity, volcanic eruptions, even human industry can shift the baseline. And radiocarbon only dates the last time a living organism exchanged carbon with the atmosphere, not the moment a wall was raised or a story was first told. A piece of wood burned in a hearth may already have been centuries old when it met the flame. A beam reused from an older structure can make a younger building appear older. So archaeologists do what they can. They cross-check, they calibrate, they compare. Thermoluminescence for fired pottery, dendrochronology for tree rings where they survive, optically stimulated luminescence for sediments last touched by sunlight. Each method has its range, its error bars, its silent assumptions. And yet out of this uncertainty, we draw sharp lines. The Neolithic begins here. Bronze starts here. Writing appears here. Civilization arises here. Why? Because without lines, the story dissolves. Mainstream chronologies are not conspiracies. They are consensus frameworks, scaffolding built from thousands of local observations. But consensus has weight. Once a framework is constructed and taught, it becomes more than a model. It becomes the story. And anything that does not fit the story is quietly questioned, reinterpreted, or set aside as anomalous until, or unless, it can be made to conform. Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example. When it was first dated to around 9,600 BCE, older than agriculture as we define it, older than pottery in many regions, older than cities by millennia, it did not fit. So the narrative bent around it. Perhaps, scholars suggested, complex ritual came before settled life. Perhaps hunter-gatherers were more organized than we assumed. Perhaps the categories of hunter and farmer, simple and complex, are too crude. The date itself was reluctantly accepted because the stratigraphy and radiocarbon were solid, repeated, consistent. The story had to be adjusted. But when other findings threaten to stretch the timeline too far, resistance stiffens. Claims of much older human presence in the Americas, tools or footprints dated tens of thousands of years beyond the accepted entry window, are challenged rigorously. Sometimes overturned with good reason, sometimes dismissed because they would require rethinking entire academic careers, rewriting textbooks, revising models calibrated over decades. Alternative chronologies, those that propose lost advanced civilizations, tens of thousands of years before Sumer, cataclysmic resets, forgotten eras of global culture, rarely gain traction in mainstream journals. Not necessarily because the idea itself is impossible, but because the evidence, as currently framed, is tenuous, ambiguous, or indirect. Massive stone blocks, precise alignments, unexplained anomalies in myth and language. These are intriguing, but they are not, by the strict rules of the discipline, decisive. The guardians of conventional timelines ask a fair question. Where is the clear, datable, unambiguous layer of advanced industry? Where are the bronze foundries, the smelting slag, the dense urban trash deposits, the unmistakable signatures of large-scale long-term complexity? If a truly advanced civilization existed 20,000 or 50,000 years ago, they argue, where is its garbage? But beneath that fair question lies another, less often voiced. What if the signature of a civilization does not always look the same? What if some eras focused on stone rather than metal, on organic materials now vanished, on technologies that leave subtler residues, harmonic architecture, encoded language, astronomical knowledge passed mouth to ear? What if their garbage has already been ground to dust under ice sheets, sunk under continental shelves now drowned by post-glacial seas, or buried beneath kilometers of sediment? Even mainstream archaeology, cautious as it must be, acknowledges an uncomfortable truth. The deeper we go into prehistory, the less we know, and the more sophisticated early humans start to look. We now know that Neanderthals painted cave walls, made jewelry, may have buried their dead with care. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers tracked sky cycles well enough to mark lunar phases on bone and antler. The builders of megalithic sites aligned stone with solstice sunrises and star risings long before what we call written history begins. This acknowledgement grows louder with each discovery. The earliest known temple is older than the first known city. The earliest known astronomical site may be older than the first known script. Evidence of complex seafaring appears earlier than we thought people dared to leave the site of land. Everywhere, the origin points creep backward. And yet, beyond a certain horizon, the record falls off a cliff. Before about 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age receded, our picture of human achievement grows fragmentary. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower. Vast coastal plains, prime real estate for settlement, are now submerged. Whatever stood there now lies beneath the waves. Ice sheets carved, crushed, and scraped entire continents. In many regions, only caves, deep sediments, and highlands preserve glimpses of what might have been. So we are left with questions. The archaeological record we possess may be a small, biased sample of what once existed. A story reconstructed from the few pages of a book that happened to survive in a flooded library. From those pages, we see sudden sophistication, perfectly tuned stone circles, intricate mythic systems, mathematics in clay. We see what looks like memory. This is where the idea of cyclical civilizations enters, not as a certainty, but as a possibility that will not quite go away. Many ancient cultures spoke of ages and worlds. The Hindu yugas, the Mesoamerican suns, Greek myths of successive races of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each rising, flourishing, and falling. Plato's Atlantis, destroyed in a single catastrophic day and night, is only the most famous of these echoes. The Sumerians themselves framed history as pre-flood and post-flood, an axis of water dividing two orders of time. Modern geology recognizes cataclysm, massive volcanic eruptions, comet impacts, sudden outburst floods, younger Dryas climate shifts that transform global conditions within a human lifetime. We know that coastlines moved, ecosystems collapsed, species vanished. It does not strain the imagination to think human societies, whatever their level of advancement, were also erased, reset, forced to begin again upon their own ruins. The question is not whether catastrophe happens. It does. The question is, how much did it erase? Here, mainstream and alternative views diverge not on the data itself, but on how boldly to extrapolate from it. The cautious scholar sees gaps and shrugs. We do not know yet. The speculative mind sees the same gaps and whispers. Perhaps we have forgotten more than we remember. And woven through all of this is human psychology. We are drawn to these mysteries for reasons that go beyond carbon dates and sediment layers. There is something deeply unsettling and deeply thrilling about the thought that we are not the first to stand at the edge of knowledge, that others before us may have charted the skies, written their codes, sung their ratios into stone and song, and then vanished, leaving only hints behind. These hints do not prove lost global super-civilizations. They do not by themselves rewrite the chronology of the world, but they do something more subtle. They erode the certainty that our current timeline is complete. They remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when so much of our planet's surface has been reworked, drowned, or left unexplored. Mainstream archaeology, at its best, is beginning to embrace this humility. It increasingly acknowledges that early humans were not dull-witted brutes stumbling blindly towards civilization, but observant, intelligent beings capable of symbolic thought, long-term planning, and technical insight. It admits that there are dark stretches of time about which we know next to nothing. It concedes that the origin points of many practices, agriculture, monumental building, seafaring, skywatching, may lie deeper in the past than our current evidence shows. Yet the discipline is also right to demand rigor, to separate what can be measured from what can only be imagined, to remind us that a compelling story is not the same as a confirmed fact, that our desire for an older, stranger world must not blind us to the difference between signal and noise. So what do we really know? We know that sophisticated knowledge appears early, abruptly, in multiple regions. We know that some of this knowledge, advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, perfected metallurgy, looks less like the result of slow, local trial and error, and more like the refinement of an existing system, remembered and reapplied. We know that myths across cultures preserve strikingly similar motifs of destructions and renewals, teachers and survivors, gifts and recoveries. We know that our dating methods, while powerful, carry assumptions and limitations that leave shadows where certainties ought to be. Beyond that, we walk on softer ground. Perhaps there were civilizations before the ones we know, their cities now silt and sand, their metals long corroded, their language dissolved. Perhaps there were only scattered pockets of brilliance, islands of concentrated knowledge in a wider sea of simpler life. Or perhaps what we see as discontinuity is merely the ragged edge of a continuous gradual climb, distorted by the accidents of preservation. What is certain is this: the mystery itself endures. It persists in every anomalous artifact, every undeciphered symbol, every temple that appears too early, every legend that sounds too much like history. It persists because it touches something in us. The sense that we are part of a story older than we remember, inheritors of a legacy whose full extent we have yet to grasp. And so, as you drift towards sleep, the dates and debates can fade. What remains is the quiet awareness that our timeline is not a closed book, but a draft. That beneath the neat lines of our history, deeper layers wait in the dark, holding stories we have not yet learned to read. So now, at the edge of sleep, we're left with a trail of fragments scattered across 6,000 years of record keeping. King lists that speak of rulers whose reigns stretch not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Flood stories carved into clay, echoed in Hebrew scrolls, Vedic hymns, Andean legends, and the myths of distant islands that never knew each other's names, all remembering a world drowned and a few who survived. Stone circles at Göbekli Tepe, rising from the Neolithic darkness, with geometry and symbolism that should not exist for hunter-gatherers who were not supposed to build temples at all. Egyptian monuments aligned with stars as though they were part of a cosmic machine, their foundations hinting at dates older than their own inscriptions will admit. Tablets that do not merely pray, but calculate. Venus cycles mapped with a patience that spans generations. Jupiter and Saturn tracked across centuries. The slow wobble of Earth's axis encoded in numbers that imply an almost impossible memory. Mathematics that anticipates Pythagoras. Geometry that appears fully formed. Algorithms for roots and growth and interest that vanish for millennia before reappearing under other names in other lands. Bronze that arrives not as an experiment, but as a conclusion. Perfect alloys at the very moment we are told metallurgy was just beginning. And beneath it all, the strange, orphaned language. Sumerian, appearing in the record as if it stepped out of silence already dressed in grammar, and poetry, carrying with it a writing system that could bind heaven, earth, and number into wedge-shaped marks. A tongue that claims in its own myths that it did not invent knowledge but received it. A script whose hymns hum with hidden ratios, music and mathematics fused into prayer, as though the very act of speaking to the gods required tuning oneself to the underlying frequencies of creation. We can explain much of this with patience, with cautious scholarship, with the slow work of excavation and comparison. We can say that oral traditions stretch further than we think, that human beings are clever, that cultures rise, experiment, and forget. And we should say these things because humility is the first tool we need when we peer into the dark behind history. The further back we look, the less certain we become. Our timelines, our neat diagrams, our confident labels begin to blur at the edges. And yet, there remains a residue that does not wipe away so easily. A sense that somewhere behind the known story, behind the first cities rising from the floodplains, behind the first kings inscribing their names, there was something older, a previous cycle, a civilization or a network of civilizations that reached up toward the stars, mapped their motions, measured their harmonies, and encoded their knowledge in forms meant to survive water, fire, and forgetting. Whether that world was real in stone and metal, or real only in the deep collective memory of survivors, is a question we may never answer. But the question itself matters, because it changes how we see ourselves. If civilization is not a ladder we built step by step, but a library we keep rebuilding after each catastrophe, then our role is different. We are not just inventors, we are caretakers. We are the latest in a long line of remembering beings, trying to rescue meaning from the ruins. To lie here, listening at the threshold of sleep, is to join that work in a small way, to keep the questions alive, to let the shadows of lost temples, impossible alignments, forgotten formulas, and orphaned languages drift through your thoughts and settle gently in the back of your mind. Somewhere, far beneath our cities and our screens, clay tablets still rest in the dark. Stones still hold the alignments they were given. Star charts still wait for eyes patient enough to read them. As you drift off, let yourself wonder what else might be buried. Under deserts, beneath oceans, inside myths we have not yet learned to translate. How many times have we begun again? How many libraries have burned? How many melodies, carved into stone and language, are we slowly relearning without even knowing it? If these mysteries kept you company tonight, if they helped you feel that vastness just beyond the edge of what we know, you can gently tap like before you sleep. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe to journey a little further each night into these shadowed corners of history. For now, let the questions rest beside you like quiet companions. The past is older than we remember. You can close your eyes, and we'll continue searching next time